When I found that faded photograph wedged between the torn vinyl seats of my empty city bus that cold December evening, I had no idea it would lead me back to a love I thought had died 43 years ago, and prove that sometimes the heart keeps beating for people we've spent half a lifetime trying to forget. If you believe in second chances and the mysterious ways that fate brings lost souls back together, stay with me, because this story will remind you that it's never too late to find your way home to the person who was always meant to be your forever. My name is Frank Morrison, and I've been driving Route 47 through downtown Portland for 26 years, watching this city change from a sleepy northwestern town into something I barely recognize anymore. At 68 years old, I thought I'd seen everything there was to see from behind the wheel of a TriMet bus, from late-night arguments between strangers to early morning confessions from people who needed someone, anyone, to listen to their problems. But nothing in my decades of public transportation had prepared me for what I discovered during my final safety check on December 18th, a Tuesday night when the rain was coming down so hard it sounded like bullets hitting the windshield. It was 11:15, and I was doing my routine end-of-shift inspection, checking under seats for forgotten belongings, lost phones, and the occasional wallet that would make someone's Christmas morning a little brighter when they got it back. The bus depot was nearly empty, except for a few mechanics working the night shift, their fluorescent work lights casting long shadows across the maintenance bay, where buses sat like sleeping giants waiting for tomorrow's routes. I'd been looking forward to getting home to my small apartment on Burnside Street, heating up some leftover soup, and watching the late news before falling asleep in my recliner, like I had every night for the past 15 years, since my wife Helen passed away from complications related to her diabetes. That's when I saw it, tucked so far back between seat cushions 17 and 18 that I almost missed it completely. Just a corner of what looked like old photographic paper, the kind they used to print pictures on, back when people actually developed film instead of keeping everything on their phones. At first, I figured it was probably just another piece of trash that had worked its way into the cracks over months of daily passengers, but something about the way the light caught that little corner made me curious enough to work it free with the tip of my flashlight. What I pulled out was a photograph that had obviously been handled so many times. The edges were soft and rounded, the surface scratched and faded in places where fingers had traced over faces that clearly meant something important to whoever had been carrying it around. The picture showed a group of 6 people standing in front of what looked like a small-town diner, the kind of place where everyone knows your name and your usual order, where coffee costs 50 cents and the pie is always homemade. They were all young, probably in their early 20s, dressed in the casual clothes of the mid-1970s, with hair that immediately transported me back to a time when life felt full of infinite possibilities and the future stretched out ahead like an empty highway, waiting to be traveled. But it wasn't the vintage quality of the photograph that made my hands start shaking as I held it under the harsh fluorescent lights of the empty bus. It was the faces, especially the girl in the center with the long auburn hair and the smile that had haunted my dreams for more than 4 decades. Margaret Rose Sullivan, the only woman I'd ever truly loved, the one who got away because I was too young and too stupid to fight for her when it mattered most. Standing next to her with his arm around her waist was a younger version of myself, Frank Morrison at 24 years old, grinning at the camera like I owned the world and everything in it was exactly as it should be. I turned the photograph over with trembling fingers, and written in faded blue ink in Margaret's unmistakable handwriting were words that made my world stop spinning and my heart start racing like I was that 24-year-old kid again. Frank, we're all still here in Millfield, room 12, Sunset Motel. Come find us. We're alive. Below that, in smaller letters that I had to squint to read, was a date from just 3 weeks ago and a phone number with a 541 area code that I recognized as somewhere in rural Oregon. The impossible part wasn't just finding a photograph of people I hadn't seen since 1981, people I'd spent years trying to track down through old phone books and early internet searches that always led to dead ends and disconnected numbers. The impossible part was that according to everything I'd been told, according to the newspaper clipping I'd kept in my wallet for 43 years, Margaret Rose Sullivan had died in a car accident on Highway 101 just outside of Seaside, Oregon, on March 15, 1982, along with 3 other people whose names I'd memorized because they were the last connection I had to the woman who'd broken my heart by leaving without explanation. And then, I thought, died before I could find her, and tell her that I'd never stopped loving her. I sat down heavily in the driver's seat of my empty bus, staring at that photograph and trying to make sense of what I was seeing, what I was reading, what it could possibly mean that Margaret was not only alive, but apparently living just a few hours south of Portland, in a town I'd never heard of, waiting for me to find her, like she'd somehow known that fate would eventually put this picture in my hands. The rational part of my mind, the part that had gotten me through 26 years of dealing with difficult passengers and Portland traffic, was telling me this had to be some kind of mistake, some elaborate hoax or case of mistaken identity that would only lead to disappointment and heartbreak. But the part of my heart that had never stopped hoping, never stopped wondering what might have happened if I'd made different choices back when we were young and thought we had all the time in the world, was already planning the route to Millfield and calculating how many personal days I had saved up for emergencies. Because if there was even a chance that Margaret was alive, if there was even a possibility that the love we'd shared before pride and miscommunication and family pressure tore us apart was still burning somewhere in her heart, the way it had never stopped burning in mine, then I had to know the truth, no matter how much it might hurt to discover that some stories don't get the endings we spend decades hoping for. The drive to Millfield took me through parts of Oregon I'd never seen before, winding mountain roads that climbed through forests so dense and green they looked like something from a fairy tale, past small towns where time seemed to move slower and people still waved at strangers passing through. I'd called in sick for the first time in 5 years, telling my supervisor, Jerry, that I had a family emergency that couldn't wait, which wasn't exactly a lie, since Margaret had been more family to me than anyone I'd been related to by blood. The December morning was crisp and clear, with that particular quality of winter light that makes everything look sharp and new, like the world has been washed clean and given another chance to get things right. As I drove deeper into the Cascade foothills, I found myself remembering details about Margaret that I thought I'd forgotten, pieces of our time together that had been buried under decades of trying to move on and build a life without her. The way she used to laugh at my terrible jokes, throwing her head back with complete abandon like my words were the funniest things she'd ever heard. How she'd steal bites of my food, even when she'd ordered exactly the same thing, claiming it always tasted better when it came from someone else's plate. The soft way she'd say my name when she was falling asleep, like it was a prayer or a promise or both. The morning we'd talked about getting married someday, maybe buying a little house with a garden where she could grow tomatoes and I could build furniture in a workshop out back, dreams that seemed so possible when we were lying in bed watching sunrise paint patterns on her bedroom wall. What had gone wrong between us wasn't any one big thing, which somehow made it worse than if there had been cheating or fighting or some dramatic reason for our relationship to end. It was a slow accumulation of small misunderstandings, missed opportunities to really talk about what we were feeling, family pressures that pulled us in different directions when we should have been pulling together. Her parents had never thought I was good enough for their daughter, a working-class kid from the wrong side of Portland, whose biggest ambition was driving trucks for a living, not the kind of man they'd imagined walking their precious Margaret down the aisle. My own pride had kept me from fighting for her the way I should have, from showing up at her door, and refusing to leave until we worked through whatever was making her pull away from me with each passing week. The last time I'd seen her was at Morrison's Diner on a rainy Thursday in October 1981, when she told me she was moving back to California to help take care of her sick grandmother, that we should probably take a break from each other while she figured out what she wanted to do with her life. I'd been hurt and angry, too young to understand that sometimes people run away, not because they don't love you, but because they love you so much it scares them into making choices that protect their heart from the possibility of getting broken beyond repair. I'd said things that night that I'd regretted for 43 years. Words about how maybe she was right, maybe we weren't meant to be together after all. Maybe it was better to end things before we made each other even more miserable. She'd cried then, tears that should have told me everything I needed to know about how she really felt, but I was too stubborn and hurt to see past my own wounded pride, to recognize that she was asking me to fight for us without actually saying the words. So instead, I'd walked out of that diner and spent the next 6 months convincing myself that I was better off without her, that there were plenty of other women in Portland who would appreciate what I had to offer, that love wasn't supposed to be so complicated and difficult and emotionally exhausting. It wasn't until I saw that newspaper article about the car accident, with her name listed among the victims, that I realized I'd thrown away the best thing that had ever happened to me because I was too proud to admit that losing her would destroy me. The Sunset Motel in Millfield looked exactly like what you'd expect from a place that probably hadn't been updated since the Carter administration, with peeling paint on the office door and a neon sign that flickered between vacancy and no vacancy, like it couldn't make up its mind about whether it wanted customers or not. Room 12 was at the far end of the building, next to a vending machine that hummed loudly, and a payphone that probably hadn't worked since the Clinton era. I sat in my car for 10 minutes, staring at that door and trying to work up the courage to knock, wondering what I would say to a woman I hadn't seen in over 4 decades, how I would explain why it had taken me so long to find her, whether she would even remember me the way I'd never been able to forget her. When the door finally opened, it wasn't Margaret who answered, but a man about my age with grey hair and kind eyes who looked vaguely familiar, like someone I might have known in another lifetime. "Frank Morrison," he said with a smile that reached all the way to his eyes. "We've been waiting for you for a very long time. Please come in. Margaret's here, and she's been hoping you'd find that picture and understand what it meant." Behind him I could see other people, faces that were older but recognizable from that photograph, friends from our old group who I thought had died along with Margaret in that accident that apparently never happened. And then she appeared in the doorway, Margaret Rose Sullivan at 67 years old, still beautiful in a way that made my breath catch in my throat, still carrying herself with the same grace and warmth that had made me fall in love with her when we were both young enough to believe that love was simple and straightforward and would always be enough to overcome any obstacle life threw at us. Her hair was silver now instead of auburn, and there were lines around her eyes that spoke of decades of laughter and sorrow and everything in between. But when she smiled at me, it was the same smile that had lit up my world 43 years ago, the same expression of pure joy that had made me believe I could accomplish anything as long as she was beside me. "Hello, Frank," she said softly, and the sound of my name in her voice was like coming home after the longest journey of my life. "I wasn't sure you'd remember me after all these years, or if you'd want to see me again after the way things ended between us. But I've thought about you every single day since I left Portland, and I've hoped that maybe someday we'd get another chance to finish the conversation we started that night at Morrison's Diner. You know what's beautiful about stories like this? They remind us that love doesn't have an expiration date, that the connections we make with certain people in our lives are so deep and true that time and distance and even decades of separation can't break them completely. If this story is touching something in your heart, if it's bringing back memories of someone you've never quite been able to forget, or if it's giving you hope that maybe it's not too late for your own second chance at happiness, I want you to know that you're not alone in feeling these emotions. Love stories like Frank and Margaret's happen every day to ordinary people who refuse to give up on the possibility that their perfect person is still out there, waiting for the right moment to come back into their lives. We share these stories here because we believe that hope is never wasted, that love is always worth fighting for, and that sometimes the most beautiful chapters of our lives are the ones we write when we think it's too late to start over. If these stories speak to your heart the way they speak to mine, I'd love for you to join our community of believers in second chances and unexpected reunions. Let us know in the comments about the person you've never forgotten, the love that got away, or the moment when someone from your past walked back into your life and changed everything. Your story matters, and sharing it might be exactly what someone else needs to hear today. What Margaret told me in that small motel room, surrounded by friends I'd mourned for decades, would challenge everything I thought I knew about loss, grief, and the lengths that people will go to protect the ones they love from dangers that seem impossible to escape. The car accident that I'd read about in the newspaper, the one that supposedly killed Margaret and 3 others from our close-knit group of friends, had been staged as part of a witness protection program that was so secretive even their families had been told they were dead. Margaret's older brother Danny had gotten involved with some very dangerous people in the illegal gambling business down in California, people who had threatened to hurt everyone Danny cared about unless he paid back money he'd borrowed and lost in bad investments that were supposed to make him rich quick. The FBI agent who came to see me explained that Danny's life was in immediate danger and that the people he owed money to had already started making threats against me, against our parents, against anyone who might be leveraged to force him to come up with cash he didn't have, Margaret said as we sat on the motel room's small couch, her hand in mine like no time had passed at all. Like we were still those young people who used to spend hours talking about everything and nothing while the world moved around us, without touching the bubble of contentment we'd created together. They offered him a deal, testify against the crime family that was running the gambling operation, help them build a case that would put some very bad people in prison for a very long time. And in exchange they would relocate him and anyone else who might be in danger to a new location, with new identities and enough money to start over somewhere safe. The catch was that in order for the protection to work, everyone involved had to disappear completely, permanently, with no contact whatsoever with their old lives, their families, or anyone who had known them before. The staged car accident had been the FBI's way of making sure that the criminals who might come looking for Danny and his associates would stop searching once they believed their targets were dead. Margaret and the others had been given a choice: enter the program and spend the rest of their lives in hiding, or stay behind and potentially face consequences that the federal agents couldn't guarantee they'd be able to protect them from. She'd chosen to disappear rather than risk putting me or her parents in danger, believing that loving me meant protecting me from a situation I'd never asked to be part of. I wrote you letters, Frank, hundreds of them over the years, but I could never send them because any contact with my old life would have compromised the program and put everyone at risk, she continued, her voice carrying 43 years of regret and longing that matched what I'd been feeling all this time. I kept track of you as much as I could without breaking the rules, learned that you'd gotten married to Helen, that you'd become a bus driver, that you'd lost your wife to diabetes, and had been living alone for the past 15 years. I knew that reaching out to you would be selfish, that you'd built a life without me, and probably didn't want reminders of a past that might bring back painful memories. But 6 months ago, everything had changed when the last of the criminals connected to Danny's case had died of natural causes in federal prison, officially ending the threat that had kept them in hiding for over 4 decades. For the first time since 1982, Margaret and the others were free to contact people from their previous lives, free to reclaim their real names and identities, free to decide whether they wanted to try rebuilding connections that had been severed by circumstances beyond anyone's control. The photograph had been Margaret's way of testing whether I might be interested in seeing her again, a message carefully crafted to let me know she was alive without putting pressure on me to respond if I'd moved on completely and wanted to leave the past buried where it belonged. I put that picture on your bus because I knew your route, knew that eventually you'd find it during one of your end-of-shift checks, she explained, with a smile that was both nervous and hopeful. I thought if you were interested in seeing me again, you'd figure out the clues and come looking. If you weren't interested, if you decided that too much time had passed or that reopening old wounds would be too painful, you could just throw the picture away, and I'd understand that some doors are meant to stay closed forever. The next 3 days in Millfield were like stepping back in time and moving forward into the future simultaneously. Margaret and I talked for hours about everything we'd missed in each other's lives, the marriages we'd both entered hoping to find with other people, what we'd had together, the children neither of us had been blessed with, the careers and hobbies and small daily routines that had filled the decades we'd spent apart. We walked through downtown Millfield, holding hands like teenagers, visited the small antique shops and cafes where Margaret had been living under the name Mary Sullivan, creating a quiet life that was peaceful but incomplete because it was missing the one person who had always felt like home to her. I learned that she'd been working as a librarian in the town's elementary school, that she'd taught herself to paint watercolor landscapes during the long Oregon winters, that she'd never stopped hoping that someday she'd be free to find me and tell me the truth about why she'd disappeared. She learned that I'd thought about her every day for 43 years, that my marriage to Helen had been comfortable but never passionate, the way what we'd shared had been passionate, that I'd kept a photograph of the two of us hidden in my wallet behind my driver's license, a secret reminder of the love I'd never been able to let go of completely. On our 4th day together, as we sat watching sunrise paint the mountains around Millfield in shades of pink and gold, Margaret asked me the question I'd been hoping for and dreading in equal measure. Frank, I know we're not the same people we were when we were 24 years old. We've lived entire lifetimes apart from each other, made choices and mistakes and built habits that might not fit together the way they used to. But if you're willing to try, if you think there might still be something worth rebuilding between us, I'd like to see if two people in their late 60s can figure out how to fall in love all over again, this time with the wisdom and patience that comes from understanding how precious and fragile and miraculous it is when two hearts find their way back to each other after being lost for so long. I answered her by pulling out the worn photograph I'd been carrying in my wallet for 4 decades, the one that showed us at 24, young and hopeful and completely unaware of the journey that would eventually bring us full circle to this moment. "Margaret Rose Sullivan," I said, using her full name the way I used to when I wanted her to know I was being completely serious. "I've been yours since the first day I met you, and I'll be yours until the last day I draw breath. If you're willing to teach an old bus driver how to be the kind of man who deserves a second chance with the love of his life, I promise you that this time I won't be too proud to fight for us when things get complicated." 6 months later, I was standing in the small backyard of Margaret's house in Millfield, wearing the nicest suit I'd owned in 20 years and holding a bouquet of white roses that reminded me of her smile, waiting for her to appear in the doorway so we could have the wedding we should have had 43 years ago. The guest list was small but perfect. Our old friends from the photograph, who had also been in witness protection, a few neighbours from Millfield who had become like family to Margaret during her years of living quietly under an assumed name, and my supervisor Jerry from the bus depot, who had driven down from Portland to serve as my best man, because he said any love story that could survive 4 decades of separation deserved to be celebrated properly. Margaret had asked the local Methodist minister to perform the ceremony, a kind woman named Pastor Linda, who had known her as Mary Sullivan for years and had been thrilled to learn her real identity and the story of how we'd found each other again. The wedding was simple but deeply meaningful, with vows we'd written ourselves that acknowledged the pain of our long separation, while promising to make the most of whatever time we had left together. When Margaret appeared in the doorway, wearing a soft blue dress that brought out the color of her eyes, I felt the same mixture of wonder and gratitude and pure joy that I'd experienced the first time I'd fallen in love with her. Proof that some feelings are so fundamental to who we are, that they remain unchanged even when everything else about our lives has been transformed by time and experience. "Frank Morrison," she said, as she took my hands in hers, "I promise to love you with the wisdom that comes from having lost you once, and the determination never to take for granted the miracle of having you back in my life. I promise to be patient when you leave coffee cups on every surface in the house, to laugh at your terrible puns, even when I've heard them 100 times before, and to remind you every day that finding our way back to each other was worth every year we spent apart, because it taught us how precious this love really is." My own vows were shorter but no less heartfelt. "Margaret Rose Sullivan, I promise to spend whatever time God gives us making up for all the years I wasn't there to hold your hand, to listen to your dreams, to be the partner you deserved all along. I promise to love you not just for who you were when we were young, but for the incredible woman you've become, for the strength that got you through 4 decades of hiding, for the courage it took to reach out to me when you were finally free, and for the grace with which you've forgiven a stubborn old fool who was too proud to fight for you when it mattered most." The reception was held in Margaret's living room, with music from a vintage record player and a cake that her neighbor Mrs. Henderson had baked, using a recipe that had been in her family for generations. Our first dance was to "The Way You Look Tonight," the same song that had been playing on the radio the night we'd first kissed behind Morrison's Diner 45 years earlier, and as we swayed together in the soft light from Margaret's living room lamps, I marveled at how perfectly we still fit together, how natural it felt to hold her close and feel her heartbeat against my chest, and know that this time, nothing would separate us except the natural end that comes to all love stories eventually. After our wedding, we settled into a routine that felt both completely new and wonderfully familiar. I retired from driving buses and moved to Millfield permanently, selling my small apartment in Portland and using the money to help renovate Margaret's house so it would accommodate both our belongings and both our ways of doing things. We converted her spare bedroom into a workshop where I could build the furniture I'd always dreamed of making. Small tables and bookshelves and picture frames that Margaret would paint with her watercolors before we gave them as gifts to friends or donated them to local charities. Margaret continued working part-time at the elementary school library, and I became a volunteer reading tutor, discovering that I had a talent for helping struggling students gain confidence with books and learning. On weekends, we explored the hiking trails around Millfield, taking leisurely walks through forests and meadows, while talking about everything and nothing the way we had when we were young. We planted a garden together that first spring, tomatoes and lettuce and herbs that Margaret used in the meals she cooked for us, simple but delicious food that tasted better because we shared it while holding hands across our small kitchen table. The evenings were my favorite time, when we'd sit on the front porch swing I'd built and installed during my first month in Millfield, watching the sun set over the mountains, while Margaret read aloud from books we'd both loved when we were younger. Sometimes we'd talk about the children we'd never had, the grandchildren who existed only in our imaginations, but more often we focused on the present moment, on the incredible gift of being together again, when we'd both thought that chapter of our lives was closed forever. We were learning to be grandparents to each other in a way, taking care of each other's health and happiness with the gentle attention that comes from understanding how fragile life can be and how quickly the people we love can be taken away from us. One evening in late October, as we sat watching the first snow of the season dust the mountains around our small town, Margaret told me something that made me understand just how much strength it had taken for her to survive all those years of enforced separation from everyone and everything she'd ever loved. "Frank, there were nights during those first few years in witness protection when I would lie awake wondering if I'd made the right choice, if protecting you and our families from potential danger was worth the pain of living as someone I wasn't, in a place where nobody knew my real name or my real story. The FBI agents had warned us that some people in the program never adapt to their new lives, that the psychological toll of completely reinventing yourself can be devastating, even when it's necessary for physical survival." She'd gotten through those dark periods by writing letters to me that she could never send, journal entries that started with "Dear Frank" and continued with updates about her daily life, observations about the small town where she was learning to blend in, memories of our time together that she was afraid she might forget if she didn't write them down somewhere safe. She'd also created an elaborate fantasy about what our life might have been like if circumstances had been different, imagining the house we might have bought together, the trips we might have taken, the ordinary moments of domestic happiness that she was missing while she waited for the day when it would be safe to contact me again. "But the hardest part wasn't missing you, although that was agony that never really went away," she continued, her voice soft but steady as snowflakes began to fall more heavily outside our warm living room. "The hardest part was not knowing if you were happy, if you'd found someone else to love who could give you all the things I wanted to give you but couldn't, because I was trapped in a situation that made any kind of normal relationship impossible. I used to pray every night that you'd meet someone wonderful, someone who could love you the way you deserved to be loved, even though the selfish part of my heart hoped you'd never forget me completely." Learning about Helen, my late wife, and how Margaret had somehow kept track of our marriage from a distance was one of the most emotionally complex conversations we had during our first year back together. Margaret had known about Helen's death from complications related to her diabetes, had wanted to reach out to me during that difficult time, but hadn't been able to because the witness protection program was still in effect, and any contact with her previous life would have been dangerous for everyone involved. She'd grieved for me from afar, understanding that I was experiencing the kind of loss she'd been living with for decades, the hollow ache of missing someone who had been central to your daily existence and suddenly wasn't there anymore. "I want you to know that I'm grateful Helen was in your life, Frank," Margaret said one morning as we shared coffee and watched deer graze in the meadow behind our house. "From what you've told me about her, she sounds like she was a good woman who took care of you during years when I couldn't be there to do it myself. I don't think of her as competition or as someone who took my place, because the truth is that you needed companionship and love during those decades when I was forced to be dead to everyone who had ever mattered to me. I'm glad you weren't alone all that time, glad you had someone to share meals with and laugh with and take care of when she got sick." Helen had been a perfectly nice woman, a widow I'd met at the senior center, where I occasionally played checkers on Sunday afternoons, and our relationship had grown slowly from friendship to companionship, to a quiet kind of love that was comfortable and supportive but never passionate, the way my feelings for Margaret had been passionate. We'd been married for 12 years, and they'd been good years in their own way, filled with routine and stability, and the kind of gentle affection that develops between two people who choose to take care of each other without necessarily setting each other's souls on fire. When Helen got sick, I'd cared for her with dedication and tenderness, and when she died, I'd mourned her sincerely, while also feeling guilty about the part of my heart that had never quite belonged to her completely. "Margaret, there's something I need to tell you about my marriage to Helen," I said, taking her hand and looking directly into her eyes so she could see that I was being completely honest. I loved her, and our marriage was real and meaningful, but I never stopped comparing every moment with her to memories of what we'd had together when we were young. That wasn't fair to Helen, and it probably wasn't healthy for me either, but I couldn't help feeling like I was living a substitute life, like I was going through the motions of being a husband, while the deepest part of my heart was still waiting for someone who I thought was dead. What surprised me was how understanding Margaret was about my relationship with Helen, how she seemed to view my marriage not as a betrayal of what we'd shared, but as evidence that I'd tried to build a meaningful life despite carrying the pain of losing her. She told me that she'd gone on a few dates during her years in Millfield, had even had a brief relationship with a retired teacher named Robert, who had been kind and patient and completely bewildered by her reluctance to talk about her past or make any long-term commitments. She'd ended things with Robert not because he wasn't a good man, but because being with him only made her more aware of what was missing, more conscious of the fact that her heart belonged to someone she might never see again. Now, at 70 and 68 respectively, we were learning to build a life together with the wisdom that comes from having loved other people, having lost people we cared about, having experienced enough of life to understand what really matters and what's just superficial noise that distracts from the essential business of loving and being loved in return. We were more patient with each other's quirks and habits than we might have been at 24, more appreciative of simple pleasures like sharing breakfast or watching old movies together on rainy afternoons, more conscious of making the most of our time together because we both understood how quickly everything can change without warning. Margaret started attending my annual bus driver reunion in Portland, where she charmed my former colleagues with stories about life in Millfield and helped me host barbecues in our backyard for drivers who had become like family to me over the years. I became a regular at the Millfield Community Center, where Margaret had been volunteering for years, helping with programs for elderly residents who were dealing with loneliness and isolation. Together, we became known around town as the couple who had found each other again after 4 decades apart, a love story that gave hope to other people who had lost touch with someone important and wondered if it might be possible to reconnect across the years. Our second wedding anniversary was celebrated with a trip to the Oregon coast, where we stayed in a bed and breakfast overlooking the Pacific Ocean and spent our days walking on beaches where the winter storms had left behind treasures of driftwood and sea glass that Margaret collected for her art projects. On our last evening there, as we sat on the deck of our room watching sunset paint the water in shades of orange and pink, Margaret asked me if I ever wondered what our lives might have been like if the witness protection situation had never happened, if we'd been able to stay together and grow old side by side from the beginning. "Sometimes I think about that," I admitted, pulling her closer so we could share the warmth of the blanket we'd wrapped around ourselves against the cool ocean breeze. "I imagine us buying a house together when we were in our 20s, maybe having children who would have given us grandchildren to spoil and love. I think about all the anniversaries we missed, all the birthdays and holidays, and ordinary Tuesday evenings that we should have shared but couldn't because circumstances beyond our control kept us apart for most of our adult lives. But then I told her something that I'd been thinking about for months, something that had become clearer to me with each passing day of our life together in Millfield. But you know what, Margaret? I think maybe we needed to live those separate lives, needed to experience loss and disappointment, and the kind of growth that only comes from facing difficulties on your own, so that when we found each other again, we'd be mature enough to appreciate what we have, instead of taking it for granted the way young people sometimes do. Maybe we love each other more deeply now, because we know what it feels like to live without each other. Maybe we're better partners at 70 than we would have been at 30 because we've learned patience and forgiveness and the art of cherishing ordinary moments. If this story has touched your heart, if it's reminded you that love doesn't have an expiration date and that it's never too late for a second chance at happiness, then you're exactly the kind of person we love having in our community here. We share stories like Frank and Margaret's because we believe that hope is always worth holding on to, that the connections we make with certain special people in our lives are strong enough to survive decades of separation, and that sometimes the most beautiful love stories are the ones that bloom again after we think they're over forever. Your own story matters, whether it's about finding love in your golden years, reconnecting with someone from your past, or simply believing that your perfect person is still out there, waiting for the right moment to walk into your life. Please share with us in the comments about the person you've never forgotten, the love that got away, or the moment when you realized it was never too late to fight for what your heart truly wanted. If you know someone who needs to hear that second chances are real, that love can survive anything, and that the best chapters of our lives might be the ones we haven't written yet, please share this story with them. Subscribe to our channel if you believe in the power of love to heal old wounds, bridge impossible distances, and prove that some bonds between two people are stronger than time, stronger than circumstances, stronger than anything life can throw at them. Together, we're building a community of believers in happy endings, second chances, and the miraculous ways that love finds a way to bring the right people back together exactly when they need each other most.